Political economy starts with the fact of private property. It does not explain it to us. It conceives of the material process that private property in fact goes through in general abstract formulae which then have for it the value of laws. But political economy tells us nothing about how far these external, apparently fortuitous circumstances are merely the expression of a necessary development. We have seen how it regards exchange itself as something fortuitous. The only wheels that political economy sets in motion are greed and war among the greedy, competition, but because the classical economists had failed to understand the necessary connection and development of different economic factors, they could give no coherent account of economics. He, on the contrary, aimed to understand the essential connection of private property, selfishness, the separation of labor, capital and landed property, of exchange and competition, of the value and degradation of man, of monopoly and competition, etc. The connection of all this alienation with the money system. The usual method of the economist was to suppose a fictitious primordial state and to proceed from there. But this simply accepted as a fact what it was supposed to be explaining. Similarly, the theologian explains the origin of evil through the fall, i.e. he presupposes as a historical fact what he should be explaining. Before introducing his main point, Marx once more insisted on its empirical basis. We start, he says, with a contemporary fact of political economy. This fact was the general impoverishment and dehumanization of the worker. Marx developed the implications of this, thus introducing the theme of this section: the object that labor produces, its product, confronts it as an alien being, as a power independent of the producer. The product of labor is labor that has solidified itself into an object, made itself into a thing, the objectification of labor. The realization of labor is its objectification. In political economy, this realization of labor appears as a loss of reality for the worker, objectification as a loss of the object or slavery to it, and appropriation as alienation, as externalization. Simply stated, what Marx meant when he talked of alienation was this: it is man's nature to be his own creator. He forms and develops himself by working on and transforming the world outside him in cooperation with his fellow men. In this progressive interchange between man and the world, it is man's nature to be in control of this process, to be the initiator, the subject in which the process originates. However, this nature has become alien to man, that is, it is no longer his and belongs to another person or thing. In religion, for example, it is God who is the subject of the historical process. It is God who holds the initiative and man is in a state of dependence. In economics, according to Marx, it is money or the cash nexus that maneuvers men around as though they were objects instead of the reverse. The central point is that man has lost control of his own destiny and has seen this control invested in other entities. What is proper to man has become alien to him, being the attribute of something else. Having discussed this relationship of the worker to the objects of his production, Marx defined and analyzed three further characteristics of alienated man. The second was his alienation in the act of production. How would the worker be able to confront the product of his work as an alien being if he did not alienate himself in the act of production itself? Marx distinguished three aspects of this type of alienation. Firstly, labor was external to the worker and no part of his nature. Secondly, it was not voluntary, but forced labor. And thirdly, man's activity here belonged to another, with once more the religious parallel. As in religion, the human imagination's own activity, the activity of man's head and his heart, reacts independently on the individual as an alien activity of gods or devils, so the activity of the worker is not his own. Spontaneous activity. It belongs to another and is the loss of himself. The result of this was to turn man into an animal, for he only felt at ease when performing the animal functions of eating, drinking, and procreating. In his distinctly human functions he was made to feel like an animal. Marx had analyzed man as alienated from the product of his labor and also as alienated in the act of production. This second he also called self-alienation. He then derived his third characteristic of alienated labor from the two previous ones. Man was alienated from his species, from his fellow men. Marx then defined what he meant by species, a term he took over from Feuerbach. The two chief characteristics of a species being were self-consciousness and universality. Man is a species being not only in that practically and theoretically he makes both his own and other species into his objects, but also, and this is only another way of putting the same thing, he relates himself as to the present, living species, in that he relates to himself as to a universal and therefore free being. This universality consisted in the fact that man could appropriate for his own use the whole realm of inorganic nature. It was true that animals also produced, but only what was immediately necessary for them. It was man's nature, on the other hand, to produce universally and freely. He was able to produce according to the measure of every species and knows everywhere how to apply its inherent standard to the object. Thus man also fashions things according to the laws of beauty. Marx then completed his picture by drawing a fourth characteristic of alienation out of the first three. Every man was alienated from his fellow men. In general, the statement that man is alienated from his species being means that one man is alienated from another as each of them is alienated from the human essence. The alienation of man and generally of every relationship in which he stands is first realized and expressed in the relationship in which man stands to other men. Thus in the situation of alienated labor, each man measures his relationship to other men by the relationship in which he finds himself placed as a worker. The fact that both the product of man's labor and the activity of production had become alien to him meant that another man had to control his product and his activity. Every self-alienation of man from himself and nature appears in the relationship in which he places himself and nature to other men distinct from himself. Therefore religious self-alienation necessarily appears in the relationship of layman to priest, or, because here we are dealing with a spiritual world, to a mediator, etc. In the practical, real world, the self-alienation can only appear through the practical, real relationship to other men. Marx went on to point to practical consequences as regards private property and wages, which followed from his conclusion that social labor was the source of all value and thus of the distribution of wealth. He used his conclusion to resolve two contemporary problems. The first was the utter rejection of any system that involved the paying of wages. Wages only served to reinforce the notion of private property, and thus even the proposal of Proudhon that all wages should be equal was quite misconceived. Secondly, Marx considered extremely optimistically that universal human emancipation could be achieved through the emancipation of the working class, since the whole of human slavery is involved in the relationship of the worker to his product. He next planned to extend the entire discussion to all aspects of classical economics: barter, competition, capital, money, and also to a comparison of the relative alienations of the capitalist and the worker. But the manuscript broke off, unfinished. In spite of the incompleteness of the manuscript, it is possible to infer what the remaining portion would have contained. In his notebooks of this time, Marx set down his reflections on his reading of the classical economists. His note on James Mill's Elements of Political Economy is exceptionally long and rich. In it, Marx dealt with the categories of classical economics he had planned to discuss in the unfinished part of his manuscript on alienated labor: barter, competition, capital, and money. He concentrated on the dehumanizing effect of money and private property, finishing with an account of his conception of unalienated labor, which was the positive side of his critique of alienated labor. Marx began his note by criticizing Mill's attempt to formulate precise laws in economics, a field so chaotic and open to constant fluctuation, and proceeded to comment on Mill's description of money as the medium of exchange. In capitalist society, Marx argued, money alone gave significance to man's relationship to his fellow man and even to his products. The notebooks deal extensively with the problem of credit. Credit only increased the dehumanizing power of money. Credit is the economic judgment on the morality of a man. In credit, man himself, instead of metal or paper, has become the mediator of exchange, but not as man, but as the existence of capital and interest. Human individuality, human morality, has itself become both an article of commerce and the form in which money exists. Instead of money, paper is my own personal being, my flesh and blood, my social value and status, the material body of the spirit of money. The credit system, according to Marx, had four main characteristics. It increased the power of the wealthy, for credit was more readily available to those who already had money. It added a moral judgment to an economic one, by implying that a man without credit was untrustworthy. It compelled people to try to obtain credit by lying and deceit. And finally, credit reached its perfection in the banking system. In a short section on money later in the manuscript, Marx quoted extensively from Goethe's Faust and Shakespeare's Timon of Athens to show that money was the ruin of society. Since money could purchase anything, it could remedy all deficiencies, it was the bond of all bonds. Since money is the existing and self-affirming concept of value and confounds and exchanges all things, it is the universal confusion and exchange of all things, the inverted world, the confusion and exchange of all natural and human qualities. In truly human society where man was man, then everything would have a definite, human value and only love could be exchanged for love. And so on. It was in contrast to this society based on money and credit that Marx outlined his idea of man's Authentic social existence. Since human nature is man's true communal nature, men create and develop their communal nature by their natural action. They develop their social being, which is no abstract, universal power as opposed to single individuals, but the nature of each individual, his own activity, his own life, his own enjoyment, his own wealth. Therefore, this true communal nature does not originate in reflection. It takes shape through the need and egoism of individuals, i.e., it is produced directly by the effect of their being. It is not dependent on man whether this communal being exists or not, but so long as man has not recognized himself as man and has not organized the world in a human way, this communal nature appears in the form of alienation because its subject, man, is a self-alienated being. Men not in the abstract, but as real, living, particular individuals are this nature. With the transformation of labor into wage labor, this alienation was inevitable. In primitive barter, men only exchanged the surplus of their own produce. But soon men produced with the sole object of exchanging, and finally it becomes quite accidental and inessential whether the producer derives immediate satisfaction from a product that he personally needs, and equally whether the very activity of his labor enables him to fulfill his personality, realize his natural capacities and spiritual aims. This process was only accelerated by the division of labor that increased with civilization and meant that you have no relationship to my object as a human being because I myself have no human relation to it. Marx finished his note on money with a description of unalienated labor, and this is one of the few passages where he described in any detail his picture of the future communist society. It is therefore worth quoting at length. Supposing that we had produced in a human manner, in his production each of us would have doubly affirmed himself and his fellow men. 1. I would have objectified in my production my individuality and its peculiarity, and would thus have enjoyed in my activity an individual expression of my life, and would have also had in looking at the object the individual pleasure of realizing that my personality was objective, visible to the senses, and therefore a power raised beyond all doubt. 2. In your enjoyment or use of my product, I would have had the direct enjoyment of realizing that by my work I had both satisfied a human need and also objectified the human essence, and therefore fashioned for another human being the object that met his need. 3. I would have been for you the mediator between you and the species, and thus been felt by you and acknowledged as a completion of your own essence and a necessary part of yourself, and I would thereby have realized that I was confirmed both in your thought and in your love. 4. In my expression of my life I would have fashioned your expression of your life, and thus in my own activity have realized my own essence, my human, communal essence. In such a situation our products would be like so many mirrors, each one reflecting our essence. Thus, in this relationship, what occurred on my side would also occur on yours. My work would be a free expression of my life, and therefore a free enjoyment of my life. In work the peculiarity of my individuality would have been affirmed, since it is my individual life. Work would thus be genuine, active property. Presupposing private property, my individuality is so far externalized that I hate my activity. It is a torment to me, and only the appearance of an activity, and thus also merely a forced activity, that is laid upon me through an external, arbitrary need, not an inner and necessary one. Marx's basic thesis was thus that man's objectification of himself in capitalist society denied his species being instead of confirming it. He asserted that this was a judgment based purely on a study of economic facts. He claimed to be using the evidence presented by the classical economists themselves and only criticizing their premises. Several times he claimed merely to be giving expression to economic facts, and in the introduction to the manuscripts as a whole, he wrote, "I do not need to reassure the reader who is familiar with political economy that my results have been obtained through a completely empirical analysis founded on a conscientious and critical study of political economy." However, his use of terms like alienation and the realization of the human essence plainly show that Marx's analysis was not a purely scientific one. Nor was it empirical, if this is taken to mean devoid of value judgments. For Marx's description was full of dramatically oversimplified pronouncements that bordered on the epigrammatic. And while the economic analysis was taken over from classical economics, the moral judgments were inspired by the reading, noted above, of Schultz, Pecqueur, Sismondi, and Buret. In order to understand Marx's claims, it is important to realize that empirical for him did not involve a fact-value distinction, an idea he would have rejected, but merely that the analysis, wherever it might lead, started in the right place with man's material needs. The second of Marx's manuscripts provided the kernel to his 1844 writings, and it is this one that has aroused most enthusiasm among later commentators. It is certainly a basic text for anyone interested in socialism with a human face. In it, Marx outlines in vivid and visionary language his positive counterproposal to the alienation suffered by man under capitalism, a proposal he called communism. His conceptions obviously reflected the first of many long debates with German workers and with French socialists whose deficiencies he remarked on at the outset. Proudhon, for example, had advocated the abolition of capital, and Fourier and Saint-Simon had traced the alienation of labor to a particular form of labor. Fourier had consequently advocated a return to agricultural labor, whereas Saint-Simon saw the essential solution in terms of the correct organization of industrial labor. Communism, however, went further than these partial insights and represented the positive expression of the overcoming of private property. Naturally, the idea of communism had its own intellectual history and developed only by stages. The first form to appear, what Marx called crude communism, was merely the universalization of private property. This sort of communism is faced with such a great domination of material property that it seeks to destroy everything that cannot be possessed by everybody as private property. It wishes to abstract forcibly from talent, etc. It considers immediate physical ownership as the sole aim of life and being. This conception of communism had its counterpart in the proposal to abolish marriage and substitute the community of women. For it was the relationship between the sexes that was the immediate, natural, and necessary relationship of human being to human being. By systematically denying the personality of man, this communism is merely the consistent expression of private property, which is just this negation. Universal envy, setting itself up as a power, is the concealed form of greed which merely asserts itself and satisfies itself in another way. How little this abolition of private property constitutes a real appropriation is proved by the abstract negation of the whole world of culture and civilization, a regression to the unnatural simplicity of the poor man without any needs, who has not even arrived at the stage of private property, let alone got beyond it. The only community was a community of alienated labor, and the only equality was one of wages paid out by the community as universal capitalist. The second form of communism that Marx branded as inadequate was of two sorts. The first he described as still political in nature, whether democratic or despotic, and the second as achieving the abolition of the state, but still incomplete and under the influence of private property, i.e., of the alienation of man. Of both these forms, Marx commented, rather obscurely, communism knows itself already to be the reintegration or return of man into himself, the abolition of man's self-alienation. But since it has not yet grasped the positive essence of private property nor the human nature of needs, it is still imprisoned and contaminated by private property. It has understood its concept, but not yet its essence. The democratic communism that Marx mentioned here must have been the utopian, non-violent sort advocated by Etienne Cabot, which was increasingly popular in Paris about this time, particularly in the League of the Just. The despotic type probably alluded to the transitory dictatorship of the proletariat advocated by the followers of Babeuf. The second type of communism, involving the abolition of the state, was represented by Desemy, who coined the famous phrase about an accountant and a register being all that was necessary to ensure the perfect functioning of the future communist society. Thirdly, Marx described in a few tightly written and pregnant pages his own idea of communism, the culmination of previous inadequate conceptions. Communism is the positive abolition of private property and thus of human self-alienation and, therefore, the real reappropriation of the human essence by and for man. This is communism as the complete and conscious return of man, conserving all the riches of previous development for man himself as a social, i.e. human, being. Communism as completed naturalism is humanism, and as completed humanism is naturalism. It is the genuine resolution of the antagonism between man and nature and between man and man. It is the true resolution of the struggle between existence and essence, between objectification and self-affirmation, between freedom and necessity, between individual and species. It is the solution to the riddle of history and knows itself to be this solution. Having thus outlined his own conception of communism, Marx went on to enlarge on three of its particular aspects: its historical basis, its social character, and its regard for the individual. Dealing with the first aspect, the historical basis of communism, Marx drew a further distinction between his own communism and the underdeveloped variety. The latter types, he cited as examples the utopian communism of Cabot and Villa-Gardel, tried to justify themselves by appealing to certain historical forms of community that were opposed to private property. For Marx, this choice of isolated aspects or epochs implied that the rest of history did not provide the case for communism. In his own version, on the other hand, both as regards the real engendering of this communism, the birth of its empirical existence, and also as regards its consciousness and thought, the whole movement of history is the consciously comprehended process of its becoming. Thus the whole revolutionary movement finds not so much its empirical as its theoretical basis in the development of private property, and particularly of the economic system. This was so because the alienation of human life was expressed in the existence of private property, and it was in the movement of private property, in production and consumption, that man had hitherto attempted to realize himself. Religion, family, state, law, morality, science and art are only particular forms of production and fall under its general law. The positive abolition of private property and the appropriation of human life is therefore the positive abolition of all alienation, thus the return of man out of religion, family, state, etc., into his human, i.e. social, being. The basic alienation, Marx went on, took place in the economic sphere. Religious alienation only occurred in the consciousness of man, whereas economic alienation occurred in his real life, and thus its supersession involved the supersession of all alienations. Of course, the preaching of atheism might be important where religion was strong, but atheism was only a stage on the path to communism, and an abstract one at that. Only communism proposed a doctrine of action that affected what was real. Secondly, Marx emphasized the social character of communism and extended the reciprocal relation of man and society to man and nature. Only to social man is nature available as a bond with other men, as the basis of his own existence for others and theirs for him, and as the vital element in human reality. Only to social man is nature the foundation of his own human existence. Only as such has his natural existence become a human existence and nature itself become human. Thus society completes the essential unity of man and nature. It is the genuine resurrection of nature, the accomplished naturalism of man and the accomplished humanism of nature. This passage, and other similar ones, show Marx very much under the influence of Hegel, to such an extent that he almost said that nature was created by man. As regards the social aspect, Marx showed that the capacities peculiar to man were evolved in social intercourse. Even when a man was working in isolation, he performed a social act simply by virtue of his being human. Even thought, since it used language, was a social activity, but this emphasis on the social aspects of man's being did not destroy man's individuality, and this was Marx's third point. However much he is a particular individual, and it is precisely his particularity that makes him an individual and a truly individual communal being. Man is just as much the totality, the ideal totality, and the subjective existence of society as something thought and felt. Marx devoted most of the rest of this section to drawing a picture of unalienated man whom he called total and multi-sided. One should not, he said, have too narrow an idea about what the supersession of private property would achieve. Just as the state of alienation totally vitiated all human faculties, so the supersession of this alienation would be a total liberation. It would not be limited to the enjoyment or possession of material objects. All human faculties Marx listed: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking, observing, feeling, desiring, acting, loving would, in their different ways, become means of appropriating reality. This was difficult for alienated man to imagine, since private property had made men so stupid that they could only imagine an object to be theirs when they actually used it, and even then it was only employed as a means of sustaining life, which was understood as consisting of labor and the creation of capital. Referring to Hesse's work on this subject, Marx declared that all physical and mental senses had been dulled by a single alienation, that of having. But this absolute poverty would give birth to the inner wealth of human beings. The supersession of private property is therefore the complete emancipation of all human senses and qualities, but it is this emancipation precisely in that these senses and qualities have become human, both subjectively and objectively. The eye has become a human eye when its object has become a social, human object produced by man and destined for him. Thus in practice the senses have become direct theoreticians. They relate to the thing for its own sake, but the thing itself is an objective human relationship to itself and to man, and vice versa. I can in practice only relate myself humanly to an object if the object relates humanly to man. Need and enjoyment have thus lost their egoistic nature, and nature has lost its mere utility, in that its utility has become human utility. This cultivation or creation of the faculties could be achieved only in certain surroundings, for it is not just a matter of the five senses, but also the so-called spiritual senses, the practical senses, desiring, loving, etc. In brief, human sensibility and the human character of the senses, which can only come into being through the existence of its object, through humanized nature. The cultivation of the five senses is the work of all previous history, for plainly a starving man appreciated food in a purely animal way, and a dealer in minerals saw only value, and not necessarily beauty, in his wares. For his faculties to become human faculties, man needed to be liberated from all external constraints. It is passages such as this that have led some commentators to argue plausibly that Marx's model of human activity was an artistic one and that he drew much of his picture of man from romantic sources and particularly from Schiller. The idea of man's alienated senses finding objects appropriate to them, the attempt to form a connection between freedom and aesthetic activity, the picture of the all-round man, all these occurred in Schiller's Brief. It is also possible that there was a more contemporary and personal influence of the same nature, in that Marx spent a lot of his time in Paris in the company of Heine and Herwegh, two poets who did their best to embody the German romantic ideal. Marx's picture of the all-round, unalienated individual was drawn to some extent from models that were very present to him at the time. Marx went on to sketch the importance of industry in the history of mankind. The passages anticipated his later, more detailed accounts of historical materialism. It was the history of industry, he maintained, that really revealed human capabilities and human psychology. Since human nature had been misunderstood in the past, history had been turned into the history of religion, politics, and art. Industry, however, revealed man's essential faculties and was the basis for any science of man. In the past, natural science had been approached from a purely utilitarian angle. But its recent immense growth had enabled it, through industry, to transform the life of man. If industry were considered as the external expression of man's essential faculties, then natural science would be able to form the basis of human science. This science had to be based on sense experience, as described by Feuerbach. But since this was human sense experience, there would be a single, all-embracing science. Natural science will later comprise the science of man just as much as the science of man will embrace natural science. There will be one single science. Thus the reciprocal relationship that Marx had earlier outlined between man and nature was reflected here in his idea of a natural science of man. The last part of his manuscript on communism consisted of a discussion, both digressive and uncharacteristic of his usual approach, on the question of whether the world was created or not. One of the key ideas in Marx's picture of man was that man was his own creator. Any being that lived by the favor of another was a dependent being. Accordingly, Marx rejected the idea that the world was created, but got bogged down in an Aristotelian type of discussion about first causes in which he was defeated by his imaginary opponent until he broke off the argument and continued in a much more characteristic vein. But since for socialist man what is called world history is nothing but the creation of man by human labor and the development of nature for man, he has the observable and irrefutable proof of his self-creation and the process of his origin. Thus for socialist man, the question of an alien being beyond man and nature whose existence would imply their unreality had become impossible. For him the mutual interdependence of man and nature was what was essential, and anything else seemed unreal. Atheism, as a denial of this unreality, has no longer any meaning, for atheism is a denial of God and tries to assert through this negation the existence of man. But socialism as such no longer needs this mediation. It starts from the theoretical and practical sense perception of man and nature as the true reality. This perception, once established, no longer required the abolition of private property, no longer needed communism. Marx finished with a very Hegelian remark on the transitoriness of the communist phase. A communism represents the positive in the form of the negation, and thus a phase in human emancipation and rehabilitation, both real and necessary at this juncture of human development. Communism is the necessary form and dynamic principle of the immediate future, but communism is not as such the goal of human development, the form of human society. Here communism seems to be viewed as merely a stage in the dialectical evolution, a stage that at a given moment would have served its purpose and be superseded. The picture, in the first part of the manuscript, of true communism as the solution of the riddle of history was much more static and unhistorical. In the third and final section of the manuscripts, Marx tried to come to grips definitively with the thought of the master. He began by discussing the various attitudes of the young Hegelians to Hegel and singled out Feuerbach as the only constructive thinker. He then used Hegel to show up the weaknesses in Feuerbach's approach. Finally, he settled down to a long analysis of Hegel's fundamental error, evident generally in the phenomenology and particularly in the last chapter. Marx's style is here often obscure, involved, and extremely repetitive, as he was constantly working over and reformulating his attitude to Hegel. In his doctoral thesis, he had rejected the idea that Hegel was guilty of accommodation and demanded that apparent contradictions be resolved by appeal to Hegel's essential consciousness. In his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, he showed by reference to particular examples that Hegel's principles inevitably involved accommodation. But it was not until he transferred his attention from Hegel's philosophy of right to his phenomenology that he was able to formulate a general criticism of Hegel's dialectic. Here it was clear that Marx, although still at home with Hegel's concepts and terminology, did not confine himself to criticism on Hegel's own terms. At the same time, he still respected Hegel as a great thinker and considered his dialectic a valuable instrument for investigating the world. He also credited Hegel with having discovered, though in a mystified form, the process of man's alienation and the means by which it could be overcome. According to Marx, none of Hegel's disciples had ever attempted to face the crucial question of the validity of their master's dialectical method. The only exception to this was Feuerbach. Feuerbach is the only person to have a serious and critical relationship to the Hegelian dialectic and to have made real discoveries in this field. In short, he has overcome the old philosophy. The greatness of his achievement is in striking contrast to the unpretentious simplicity with which he presents it to the world. Feuerbach had shown that the Hegelian system was merely a philosophized form of religion and equally alienating. He had thus founded true materialism and real science by making the social relationship of man to man the basic principle of his theory. Marx briefly summarized Feuerbach's achievement in a letter he sent him in August 1844. "In your writings you have given, whether intentionally I do not know, a philosophical basis to socialism, and the communists, too, have similarly understood these works in that sense. The unity of man with man based on the real differences between men, the concept of human species transferred from an abstract heaven to the real world. What is this other than the concept of society?" Continuing with the third and final section of the manuscripts, Marx turned to look at Hegel's system. He began by copying out the table of contents of the Phenomenology, the true birthplace and secret of his philosophy, and accused Hegel of making all entities that in reality belonged objectively and sensuously to man into mental entities, since for him spirit alone was the genuine essence of man. This criticism was tempered, however, by an analysis of Hegel's achievements that clearly showed how much, despite his critical comments, he owed to him. For Marx considered that, although the concept of criticism and the phenomenology was still liable to mystify and was not sufficiently self-aware, it nevertheless went far beyond later developments. In other words, none of the disciples had as yet been able to surpass the master. Indeed, Marx made the astonishing claim for the phenomenology that it contains all the elements of criticism concealed, but often already prepared and elaborated in a way that far surpasses Hegel's own point of view. The unhappy consciousness, the honest consciousness, the struggle of the noble and base consciousness, etc., etc. These single sections contain the elements, though still in an alienated form, of a criticism of whole spheres such as religion, the state, civil life, etc. This was because the phenomenology had understood the alienation of man, contained insights into the process of man's development, and had seen that the objects which appeared to order men's lives, their religion, their wealth in fact belonged to man and were the product of essential human capacities. Marx summed up his attitude to Hegel as follows: of the greatness of Hegel's phenomenology and its final product, the dialectic of negativity as the moving and creating principle, is on the one hand that Hegel conceives of the self-creation of man as a process, objectification as loss of the object, as externalization and the transcendence of this externalization. This means, therefore, that he grasps the nature of labor and understands objective man, true because real, man as the result of his own labor. Thus, although Hegel did grasp labor as the self-confirming essence of man, yet the only labor Hegel knows and recognizes is abstract, mental labor. Although Marx's language was, as often, involved, and his arrangements somewhat haphazard, this is the passage where he gave his fullest and clearest account of his debt to, and disagreements with, Hegel. Hegel thought that reality was spirit realizing itself. In this process, spirit produced a world which it thought at first was external. Only later did it realize that this world was its own creation. Spirit was not something separate from this productive activity, it only existed in and through this activity. At the beginning of this process, spirit was not aware that it was externalizing or alienating itself. Only gradually did spirit realize that the world was not external to it. It was the failure to realize this that constituted, for Hegel, alienation. This alienation would cease when men became fully self-conscious and understood their environment and their culture to be emanations of spirit. Freedom consisted in this understanding, and freedom was the aim of history. In broad terms, what Marx did was to reject the notion of spirit and retain only finite individual beings. Thus the Hegelian relationships of spirit to the world became the Marxian notion of the relationship of man to his social being. Marx said that Hegel only took account of man's mental activities, that is, of his ideas, and that these, though important, were by themselves insufficient to explain social and cultural change. Turning to the final chapter of the Phenomenology, Marx opposed his view of man as an objective, natural being to Hegel's conception of man as self-consciousness. If man were reduced to self-consciousness, Marx objected, then he could establish outside himself only abstract objects that were constructs of his mind. These objects would have no independence vis-a-vis man's self-consciousness. Marx's own view of human nature was very different. When real man of flesh and blood, standing on the solid, round earth and breathing in and out all the powers of nature, posits his real objective faculties, as a result of his externalization, as alien objects, it is not the positing that is the subject. It is the subjectivity of objective faculties, whose action must therefore be an objective one. Marx called his view naturalism or humanism, and distinguished this from both idealism and materialism, claiming that it united what was essential both to idealism and to materialism. Marx followed this with two concise paragraphs, very reminiscent of the previous section on private property and communism, on the meaning of naturalism and objectivity. Nature seemed to mean to Marx whatever was opposed to man, what afforded him scope for his activities and satisfied his needs. It was these needs and drives that made up man's nature. Marx called his view naturalism because man was orientated towards nature and fulfilled his needs in and through nature, but also, more fundamentally, because man was part of nature. Thus man as an active natural being was endowed with certain natural capacities, powers, and drives. But he was no less a limited, dependent suffering creature. The objects of his drives were independent of him, yet he needed them to satisfy himself and express his objective nature. Thus, a being that does not have its nature outside itself is not a natural being and has no part in the natural world. Marx concluded, to be sentient is to suffer. Man as an objective, sentient being is therefore a suffering being and, since he is a being who reacts to his sufferings, a passionate being. Passion is man's faculties energetically striving after their object. This contained echoes of the 18th century French materialists, Holbach and Helvetius, but the main source for Marx's ideas and terminology when discussing nature and objectivity was Feuerbach's philosophy of the future. Following this digression on his own concept of human nature, Marx continued with his critique of the phenomenology by emphasizing that Hegel seemed to equate alienation with any sort of objectivity and thus only transcended alienation in thought. The consequence was that for Hegel, man was truly human only when he was engaging in philosophy, and that, for example, the most authentically religious man was the philosopher of religion. The last few pages of the manuscript degenerate into absolute obscurity. Indeed, throughout this whole section where Marx was wrestling so tortuously with Hegel's dialectic, the modern reader must find the arguments rather difficult to follow. Insofar as the arguments can be grasped, common sense would tend to agree with Marx as against Hegel, though it is, of course, a Hegel refracted through Marx himself. What must be remembered, however, is the dense idealist fog, created particularly by Hegel's disciples, that Marx had to disperse in order to arrive at any sort of empirical view. Marx himself supplied no conclusion to the Paris manuscripts, and it is impossible to draw one from such a disjointed work, which included discussions of economics, social criticism, philosophy, history, logic, dialectics, and metaphysics. Although each section was dominated by a separate subject, to some extent all were approached in similar fashion. Here for the first time there appeared together, if not yet united, what Engels described as the three constituent elements in Marx's thought: German idealist philosophy, French socialism, and English economics. It is above all these manuscripts which, in the West at least, reorientated many people's interpretation of Marx to the extent of their even being considered as his major work. They were not published until the early 1930s and did not attract public attention until after the Second World War. Certain facets of the manuscripts were soon assimilated to the existentialism and humanism then so much in vogue and presented an altogether more attractive basis for non-Stalinist socialism than textbooks on dialectical materialism, seen in their proper perspective. These manuscripts were in fact no more than a starting point for Marx's initial, exuberant outpouring of ideas to be taken up and developed in subsequent economic writings, particularly in the Grundrisse and in Capital. In these later works the themes of the 1844 manuscripts would certainly be pursued more systematically, in greater detail, and against a much more solid economic and historical background, but the central inspiration or vision was to remain unaltered, man's alienation in capitalist society, and the possibility of his emancipation of his controlling his own destiny through communism. Last month in Paris. While Marx had been feverishly composing his manuscripts in Paris, Jenny was re-immersing herself in the provincial life of Trier. She was glad to be reunited with her mother for whom she had so often wept in France, but the genteel poverty in which the Westphalen household was compelled to live and the sponging of her spineless brother Edgar depressed her. The baby, now provided with a wet nurse, was soon out of danger, and was the subject of long paragraphs of loving description in Jenny's letters to Marx. When her old friends and acquaintances came to see her and view the baby, she felt as though she were holding court. She fended off as best she could inquiries about exactly what sort of a job Marx had acquired in Paris. In fact, she was filled with misgivings, which she confided to her husband. "A dear heart, I have too great an anxiety about our future, both in the long and the short term, and I think that I shall be punished for my present high spirits and exuberance. If you can, please calm my fears on this point. People talk far too much about a steady income. I then answer simply with my red cheeks, my white flesh, my velvet cloak, my feathered hat and my fine ribbons." Full of anxiety, she made the difficult trip to her mother-in-law, whose attitude, she was surprised to find, had quite changed since the marriage. Marx's mother and his 3 sisters, still living at home, received her with open arms, a change of heart she could only attribute to the impression made by their new prosperity with the 1,000 thalers sent by Young. She finished her first letter to Marx with a delightful admonition, unfortunately little heeded of his style: "Please do not write in such a bitter and irritated style. Either write factually and precisely, or lightly and with humor. Please, dear heart, let the pen run over the page, and even if it should sometimes fall and stumble and cause the sentence to do likewise, yet your thoughts stand upright like grenadiers of the old guard, steadfast and brave. What does it matter if their uniform hangs loosely and is not so tightly laced? How handsome the loose, light uniform looks on French soldiers! Think of our elaborate Prussians, doesn't it make you shudder? So let the participles run and put the words where they themselves want to go. Such a race of warriors must not march too regularly. Are your troops marching to field? Good luck to their general, my black master. Farewell, dear heart, darling and only life."